Good evening. I'm Sarah Churchwell, Chair of Public Understanding of the Humanities at the University of London School of Advanced Study, and I'd like to welcome you all to the Being Human Festival's 2020 launch. Before I get down to the business of introducing the festival and turning to a discussion with our distinguished guest and festival patron, Professor David Olusoga, a couple of housekeeping points first. Please note that the chat function is closed for this event, but we will be having a Q&A later with David. For this, you can use the Q&A function on Zoom. There should be a little icon for this in your toolbar. Please be aware that this event is being recorded, including the Q&A session. Please note that any question you ask and its answer will form part of the recording that will subsequently be made available online. You can ask your question anonymously by ticking the anonymized box before submitting it. And with that out of the way, welcome to the Being Human Festival. This being 2020, nearly all of our festival events will take place online for reasons we all know all too well. And so naturally, that also includes this launch event this evening. But as many people around the world have discovered over the last 8 to 10 months, there are some silver linings to the clouds of pandemic. And one of them is how much easier it can be to create capacity for so many of you to come tonight to learn about the festival and hear David speak. In particular, we want to thank all of our festival organizers around the country who have risen to this challenge, to whom I'll return in a moment. But first, a few words about the festival. I promise to keep this brief, but we are here to celebrate the Being Human Festival, the UK's annual free national festival celebrating research in the humanities. Each November for 10 days, we support researchers around the United Kingdom in connecting their research expertise with the curiosity of local communities in creative and interactive ways. It's a festival, so we don't do academic business as usual. We're not about panel talks and symposia. We're more about pub quizzes and sing-alongs and walking tours and DIY museums. Since 2014, we've put on almost 1,500 free events all over the country and indeed around the world, attended by almost 125,000 people. In 2020, our theme is New Worlds, appropriately enough. We chose it last year having no idea how consciously we'd all be thinking about new worlds during this age of pandemic and lockdown. But despite those challenges, this year, we once again will have over 250 events organized by 80 universities and research organizations in partnership with over 200 cultural and community groups. Between the 12th and 22nd of November, events will originate in 55 towns and cities across the UK, including Glasgow, Derby, Sheffield, and Swansea, where we have festival hubs this year. They'll be online, of course, but they're also events that are deeply embedded in their local surroundings, as you're about to see. It is a festival that becomes national by virtue of being rooted in the local. This year, we're also delighted to have international events in Rome, Paris, and in Melbourne, Australia. We also have a new series of programming called Being Human Cafes, where you can discuss research over a cup of tea, just keeping it simple in this difficult year. If you want to tweet about tonight's event or the festival in general, you can find us at Being Human Fest, and please use the hashtag BeingHuman2020. I just need to say a few thank yous, and then I'm done with the introductory part here. First, I need to thank the School of Advanced Study, University of London, who sponsor and lead the festival. The Arts and Humanities Research Council and the British Academy also deserve our thanks for their generous support and funding of the festival. They've been with us from the beginning. I also want to thank all those at SAS and the University of London who help with the festival throughout the year, especially our amazing festival team who single-handedly make this national festival happen. But most of all, we need to thank our event organizers across the country, this year more than ever, for making over 250 free public engagement activities happen in spite of this year's exigencies. Their creativity and commitment has been incredibly inspiring to us all. And we hope everyone watching this tonight will find something to inspire you over the next fortnight as well. I know everyone is eager to hear from David, as indeed am I. But in our launch event every year, we usually offer a festival preview with a little showcase that offers a taste of what's to come. This year, we've made a brief film instead. It's very short, and I hope it gives a sense of what the festival is like to attend before we head into our discussion. So please enjoy this brief film highlighting some of the exciting events that will be taking place this year.
Do you have that 2020 sensation where global crises crash into each other like tectonic plates, where pandemics unmask long-standing inequalities and injustice, where colonial hangovers and racial violence are hurled into the air like fists, where statues are appended under the shadow of elections, where long summers are suspended in supermarket queues, where you scavenge the pasta shelves only to find discarded three-word slogans and streets littered with the debris of applause, where the wettest and driest and hottest months on record dance side by side to the chimes of the news bulletin, and forest fires and floods stand less than 6 feet apart. Do you have that 2020 aspiration to change hearts and chase possibilities and dreams? Do you have that 2020 anticipation for exploring our present existence in all of its nuanced complexity? Because it's time to human again. Time to exhume the bones of what it means to be, navigate the strange. We narrate the story of our living online or face to face. We face the historical and the day-to-day. We beam the magical, interrogate the canonical, and best of all, we festival to explore and contest the meaning of human.
Hi, from the Huntarian in glorious Glasgow. We're delighted to be joining Being Human 2020.
We're getting ready for the Being Human Festival here in Dundee. We're going from lockdown to countdown.
Hello from Cornwall, I'm Dr. Ruth Heaholt. This is the lovely Starglazers Cafe where we're doing our Being Human event, which will be a short talk on dystopias.
I'm Francesca, and the Great North Museum, the Hancock, and I are getting ready for the Being Human Festival 2020.
My online event is Making Medieval Ink, and I'm very busy preparing all the post-out kits to those participants, and I'm really looking forward to it.
People in Swansea look forward to this festival every year. They know it's coming and they want it to come.
Well, 2020 has been a challenging year for all of us, I think, and more than ever, people want to learn new things, we want to connect with each other, and we all want to find out more about what being human actually means. And so festivals like Being Human are a really important part of giving us that space to do that. And this year's theme of New Worlds is particularly powerful, given 2020 has been a new world for all of us.
What we've been doing is we've been working with a number of partners across the city and county to have conversations about objects in their collections, to think about how those objects can make us reimagine Derby's history, but also think about what the legacies of empire, exploitation, of exploration are for our city and county today.
We are going to be talking to members of the Sikh community and members of the wider community about the painting that's behind me. So talking about how it's best to think about the painting, to discuss what's happening inside it, the narratives, and also to talk about how best to explain it to other visitors.
It belongs to the city of Derby. This isn't just a place where objects come to die and be in a case and not be thought about and not be reimagined. This is a place that's a living gallery.
My name is Phil Smith, and together with my creative partner Helen Billinghurst as part of Crab and Bee, we're inviting local residents to use our work packs, which we will deliver door to door, to write their messages to the future and to turn them into boats, which we will launch through the flames of a fire here on the beach, propelling those messages into the future as smoke on the wind.
As part of the Being Human Festival, we are creating the People's Palace of Possibility, in which participants receive various things in the post which guide them on a mysterious journey.
My name's Linda Bloomfield, I'm producer with the Bear Project, and today we're here in my garden. Because of COVID, we've been doing most of our work from here, so we've got children playing in the background, we've got birds flying over, and this is where we've done all of the packing of the boxes for the People's Palace of Possibility. It begins with a letter like this one, with a secret message within, which then leads people to a website which reveals more about the story and more about the palace and enrolls people as palace citizens. And then the big one is this package that is received, which includes a series of tasks for palace citizens to complete.
We were really excited about Being Human's approach to involving local people in the work that's happening within the university, not only in a kind of a one-way communication of this is all the amazing research that we're doing, but also as a way that citizens could share their ideas and their views.
What I really love is the title, the idea of new worlds. I think that is absolutely where we need to be right now. We need to be optimistically thinking about how we can build new societies. And the arts and humanities have got this fantastic capacity to reimagine society. We can look at all the resources, cultural resources we have in collections up and down the country, small and large, to think this could be a different world, it could be a new world, and it can be a better world. And that, I think, is a really valuable part of what Humanities can do and what the Being Human Festival this year will offer us all.
From Glasgow to Swansea and the breadth of the in-between, there's a myriad of theatres, museums, universities, palaces, charities, cafes and galleries, preparing over 240 activities, whether socially distanced or via live stream technology, gathering ideas and groundbreaking expertise, finding new ways to frame this new world. From Glasgow to Swansea and the breadth of the in-between, we'll be sharing creatively the scope of the humanities, what it means to be we. Whether over cups of tea or over the internet, a festival to challenge the knowledge and intellect and connect the dots of living, of being human in our new worlds.
Thank you very much to all the organizers who took part in the film, and to Keith Jarrett, who composed and performed the wonderful poem and is part of Queen Mary University of London's festival series, Poetry versus Colonialism. It is now my very great pleasure to introduce Professor David Olusoga, OBE, Professor of Public History at the University of Manchester. As I don't have to tell any of you, David has presented many popular TV history series such as Civilizations, Black and British, A Forgotten History, and A House Through Time. And he is the author of the wonderful Black and British, among many other important works. And he is also, as I said, a festival patron. David proactively works to make history inclusive, expansive, and diverse. And we want to reflect on some of those projects this evening. So welcome, David. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, it's so nice to be here.
Especially given your incredibly busy schedule. I don't know how we can all stay so busy with them. On the one hand, we're all in our houses, and yet seems like we're busier than ever. I wanted to begin with your title, actually. As I just said, you're a professor of public history. And I was wondering what that means to you, how public history in your mind differs, or whether it does, from other approaches to professional history. And in particular, I was wondering whether you think public history bears a distinctive obligation to shared or pluralist histories.
Thanks. I think public history is one of those things, like many aspects of life, that in 2020, I think we have to reassess it, because normally I would sort of make the case for history being public, history being an enterprise that needs to take place within the the academy, within the heritage industry, and also within public discourse on television and all the places it can be delivered. But in 2020, that happened. History exploded into everybody's lives. It explodes into political events, and the idea that it needs me to make a case for it being public is somewhat redundant. I mean, in the image of my hometown Bristol in your film was the image of the statue of a man who died 299 years ago, being toppled this June. Now that image is the image of Bristol. That was the only time I've lived in Bristol. I've been there 22 years, when Bristol was on the front page of newspapers around the world. It was a colossal event. I did interviews with news crews from dozens and dozens of countries, because it was about history. It wasn't about our aerospace industry. It wasn't about our banking industry. It wasn't about anything about contemporary Bristol other than, like contemporary Britain and like contemporary America, history was on the march, and history was alive, and history was by its nature public. So there's no leverage needed to history has made itself public because it's absolutely at the center of enormous discussions that we're having in this country and other countries about our past, about where it's left us, where it's taken us to, about the ideas that it's hardwired into our cultures, like the idea of race, like the idea of racial hierarchies. And also history is public because the appetite for it in this country, and I mean, Britain is again not unique, but is distinct in terms of having, if you look at the list of top 10 tourist attractions in Britain, where the British people go and also tourists to Britain go to, it is ancient cathedrals and stately homes and museums and art galleries. It's not water parks. We don't have a Disneyland. It is a version of the past that people want to engage with. So history is by its nature public, and the role of public history to me is to be the connecting tissue between the world that's happening, where history is being generated, because to the shock of our politicians, history is being rewritten every day, constantly, because that's the job of historians. Public history is the interstitial tissue between the world of the academia and this enormous public realm of history in the public space. And history's never been as loud and as dominant and as attention-grabbing in the public space in 2020 than in any time I've ever been involved in history.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you say, people seem to be very anxious about the idea of history being rewritten, as if it was something that was fixed and done and they had put aside, and history was in the past. I'm always reminded of Faulkner's famous line that the past isn't dead, it isn't even past. And exactly what you're talking about is a perfect example of why that line became so famous. But the rewriting of history has, as you say, has become controversial. In certain ways, people are worried that obviously the debates over the statues are a perfect example, that history is being lost by virtue of being rewritten, and that history is being thrown away in some way. And I just want to give you a chance to rebut those claims. What do you say to people who tell you this is endangering history in these responses to it?
Well, I think the first thing we need to do is be frank, and that this is a political slogan which has been focus grouped, and the algorithms have come back with their results, and it works. It's being repeated. It's a mantra that's on the attack lines of politicians because the focus groups say it works. It doesn't have to be true. They don't care whether it's true. Many of them are history graduates. They know it's a nonsensical phrase, but it works. So we mustn't debate these phrases and imagine that they're being used in a non-cynical way. We need to confront the fact that this is about creating political or electoral coalitions by making people feel threatened about their identity and their history. So it's a false flag phrase that's being used disingenuously. But I think the reason why it's effective is a much more interesting question. And I think it's effective in Britain because we've allotted to history a very specific role. History is a place of recreation. It is a place we go to feel good about ourselves. And it is a place from which we have withdrawn all of the elements that make that difficult. If history is a safe space, then you need, if it's a soft play area, you need to take out all the sharp objects. And that's what we've done. That's why those stately homes that are on the list of places that we go to, that they don't talk about, or traditionally don't talk about. There were some, I think, very honorable exceptions, where the money came from. They don't want to talk about the imperial connections. And so when the National Trust does work, in some ways, that is a perfect example of academic work being reconnected into public history. There is a political reaction. The political reaction is because it works electorally, but it works electorally because people feel threatened, because we've created this soft play version of history. And we've used so many euphemisms and disguises and camouflages to keep these elements out of our history that, I mean, well, a couple of things are true. One is that they genuinely come as a surprise to people. And I think the onus is on people who are more familiar with these histories to try to be sympathetic with that. If you have been told and you have believed your whole life that Britain is an exceptional country, always on the side of the angels, that anything bad it did could be relativized away or explained away, then this is really challenging. If you were taught that Edward Colston in Bristol was a lovely philanthropist, a fatherly figure who opened almshouses and schools, and then you're told by a younger generation that this man was complicit in the enslavement of 80,000 people and the deaths, we estimate around 19,000, it's much easier to dismiss those people as agitators and radicals or as members of a snowflake generation than it is to confront and reimagine your history if you've built an identity on it, if it's part of how you see yourself and see your country. So that it has that fundamental problem with it. But the other thing about creating this soft play version of history is that it doesn't work demographically for the Britain that we are. We're 14% of the population. To use that suddenly unpopular acronym is BAME. We'll just come up with another acronym to replace it. And that's, according to some demographic projections, going to be 30% by 2050, by which time America will be majority minority. These histories don't work for the country we are, and they cannot work for the country we're going to become. So they're, in some ways, that this argument about history being rewritten it's a false flag argument used by politicians, but in some ways it's also a truth. The history is being rewritten because it was written for our purpose, for our country that we are no longer.
Yeah, I think that's really well said and exactly right. And I would love to explore the idea of unsafe history with you kind of all night if we could, but we don't have that much time, and I want to just get your thoughts on a few other topics. Although it is really important, I think, to say that I love that phrase. I'm going to remember that, of unsafe history, that there's safety and there's safety, right? That by actually going back and you and I both work in unsafe histories to a certain extent. And what you discover is that by working in those unsafe histories, you can actually create a more stable foundation for society today, because you're actually trying to uncover more collective and plural truths of the type that you were talking about at the beginning. So there's so much there to think about, but I do want to think about a couple of other kind of big line ideas right now, because there's so much going on. That's just one of the many crises that we're dealing with in this year of our Lord 2020. And the humanities. This is a festival of the humanities, history being one important aspect of the humanities. But the humanities have a kind of more obvious role to play in questions like, political arguments over history, in arguments about the Black Lives Matter movement and the statues. But we are also, as I say, living through these other crises, the most obviously the pandemic. We're speaking within hours of the announcement of a potential vaccine. And also, the environmental crisis, climate change. And we've spent a year really hearing about the incredibly valuable contributions that science and medicine make. And it's become very much a kind of science paradigm that people are like, we just must look to science and science will fix this. But in your view, when we think about these other crises that are not obviously historical or political, not obviously connected to questions of humanities research and humanities knowledge, do you think that the humanities also has value to bring to those conversations, or do we leave it to the scientists to sort out the pandemic and we'll try to deal with the history?
Well, I think in some ways vaccines and inoculation is the perfect example, because from the moment the idea of vaccination was invented by Jenner in the 1790s, an anti-vax movement emerged. From the moment science made this leap, it came down to conversations and storytelling and persuasion and law and everything the humanities brings to actually popularize them. There's a gulf of decades between the invention of the concept of the vaccine, of taking this other disease, a milder form related to a more dangerous disease. There's decades before this becomes law. There's decades of debate, of storytelling, of persuasion, of propaganda on both sides that involves not just science, it involves politicians, it involves artists who are involved, recruited by both sides to condemn vaccine as an alien idea. It appears in novels. The socialization of a scientific idea is as important as the scientific breakthrough as well. And we are going to face exactly the same thing. If you read the history of the anti-vaccination movements of the middle of the 19th century and you see what they're saying, and then you have the misfortune to go on social media this evening, you will see exactly the same arguments, and you will see governments facing exactly the same debates that the British government faced in the middle of the 19th century when it began to pass compulsory vaccination act. So in some ways, there's almost this division, which is very deep in British academic history, culture, which comes from the way that our school systems are designed. This split between the arts and the humanities, which is cut through. It cuts through our society because it's made to cut through us. We are made to make these terrible choices at far too young an age, and I think they're very often a false division. I think one of the big expertise that we've become more familiar with in the course of this pandemic is about the art of public persuasion. Now, strictly, is behavioral science a science, and what extent is it part of the humanities? It comes down very often to how you tell stories, and I'm afraid I do claim the narrative arts for the humanities. So I think these divisions, once you start looking at an example, a specific example that you're living through, I think they begin to crumble. And this idea, this cult of the STEM subjects begins to look sort of weaker and weaker. I mean, I was shocked to discover recently that STEM was only invented in 2001. It seems like it's been a stick to beat us with for far longer than that. And it shows how powerful that acronym has become.
Mm. But in and of itself, that shows the power of language, right? The acronym is framing the political discourse, and it's actually creating realities through rhetoric, through language. And yet we think of it as transparent, but it's absolutely manipulating language in really, really effective ways. I shouldn't say manipulating in some kind of sinister way. And I'm sure we should make the disclaimer. Obviously, we're both pro-STEM. We're both pro-science and medicine, I'm quite sure. But as you say, it's a false binary. And actually, what we want to do is to think about the ways that we can bring knowledge together to fight all of these crises that we face, or to confront these challenges that we face. I mean, my own view is we can't afford to leave any knowledge out. We need all of the knowledge we've got, because these are really major crises. I was thinking about these issues, about kind of how we think about who we are collectively, also in terms of humanities scholarship. I mean, I think the word humanities, first of all, is a stumbling block for a lot of people. So let me ask you first, obviously you're a historian. Do you think of the humanities like a paradigm that you think about your relationship to? Is it a useful way of thinking about your own work, or is it something you kind of put to one side, or is it a domain that you feel invested in?
It's definitely a domain I feel invested in, but as I said, I think it's slightly contaminated in this country by an exaggerated gulf between science and arts. And what I note as an historian is how recent that is, and how that question and that division would have seemed ludicrous to most of the sort of 18th and 19th century figures that we think of as men of science. Look at their cultural output, look at their investment in the arts, look at often their involvement in the arts. I worry that, I mean, I don't think people should choose 3 subjects at 16 I think people should be made as few decisions as possible at 16, thinking of decisions I made. But I think it's immensely damaging. And I think you see it in people's approach to factual television. A lot of the people who watch factual television are doing so because they were plucked out of whole areas of life that they would have loved to have studied and taken into university, into their to their later years, but they had to make these big decisions. So the humanities and the science and the humanities, it's such a sore subject in Britain, and I think it's such a damaging way that we force people to make this, to choose this false dichotomy, to choose a path. That I can't help thinking of the word humanities within that context, which is unfortunate.
Yeah. I think, clearly we're both here kind of to defend the humanities. It's a festival celebrating the humanities. We can lay our cards on the table. But that doesn't mean that we don't need to think very hard about the ways in which the humanities needs to do better. And I've been thinking about this because, of course, I work on American politics and cultural history. And so I've been a little preoccupied with this election that we just had, which I know you've been thinking about as well. And speaking of those catchphrases, everybody heard Americans say over and over again during the 4 years of Trump, this is not who we are. And yet there we were with Trump as our president, and he just got more votes, last week and 1 week ago tonight, as a matter of fact. Than before. And I think about that in relationship to the humanities as well, because I feel like as a discipline, as a group, as an intellectual paradigm, we promote inclusivity, we believe in pluralism, where you and I are talking about exactly these issues of equality and justice. And yet, when you actually look at humanities departments in higher education around Britain and the United States in particular, there's a really obvious failure of inclusivity there, not least because of their blinding whiteness, but also there are, issues with class inclusivity, there are issues with physical access, there are issues with all kinds of ways in which higher education broadly, but also the humanities in particular, are not anywhere near inclusive enough. And I'm just wondering, for those of us who really believe in the social value of the humanities, what do you think we need to do and to do differently to start to redress that imbalance?
Well, I think the first thing is to accept the scale of it, because it's not just the humanities as academic subjects within the world of universities. It's publishing, it's the arts, it's curatorship, it is the heritage industry, it is television and publishing. I mean, sometimes I give talks. I'm at Docklands now, overlooking Canary Wharf. Sometimes I give talks. I'm asked to come in and talk about diversity and inclusion by city law firms or by trading firms, and I'm afraid to say I often see them being far more dynamic in terms of inclusivity, in terms of outreach to the communities around them that aren't reflected currently in their staff, their makeup. I often see far more dynamism in those sorts of institutions than I see in the arts. I gave a lecture this summer to the television industry, which is the industry I spend, which is my day job. And I was very frank about the failings of television. I've been in television for a long time, and we've got nowhere. We've had 30 years of failed initiatives. Television, in terms of class and race, they're not in gender, because there has been progress there, and also not in terms of where programs are made, because again, there's been progress in diversifying it in terms of regionality in the 4 nations. But in terms of socioeconomics and race, TV's done terribly. So this is broad, and this is the people who claim to care the most, the people for whom these ideas are sacred. We have failed more than people who want to work in big shiny offices and make lots of money. And I think we have to ask why that is. And I think we have to acknowledge that that's the case, that we have not in any way lived up to our declared aims and aspirations. I think, my speculation thinking about the areas that I work in is I think we gave ourselves a free pass. I think we thought that nice liberal people in nice liberal institutions would just have nice liberal outcomes. And we didn't institute the sort of hard-headed, proactive interventionist mechanisms in HR and also the level of self-analysis that some companies did, particularly in America, and particularly in subjects in areas that are much more hard-bitten than business-based. The moment the business case was made for diversity, I saw a level of proactivity in business and finance that I still have not seen, or maybe I have seen this year, the beginnings of it. So this failure is broad, and it is us.
Yeah. I'm going to turn to questions from the audience in a moment. So I'm going to encourage people, if they have questions, to start putting those in the Q&A. But in regards to trying to redress those issues about inclusivity, one tactic or strategy that people have been thinking a lot about and talking a lot about this year is decolonization. And I know that there is some puzzlement about what decolonization means in some areas. So first of all, just for those who aren't in higher education, could you explain what we mean when we talk about decolonizing curricula and collections, and then whether you think that that is a step in the right direction, or is it a red herring? Will it get us where we need to go?
Well, I have to say it's a difficult phrase, and it's a difficult phrase because very often the sorts of terminology that comes out, particularly critical studies departments at universities, are difficult. So I don't think it helps the public case by using such a difficult phrase, but I think it's a very, very simple concept. It's about telling everyone's story and talking about everybody's contribution. I think it's fundamentally about inclusivity, but it's also about self-analysis. It's about seeing the narrowness to which we've been viewing the world, which, you know, is difficult because we've normalized it. We've found ourselves comfortable with certain groups and their output and their creativity. We've defined what is good, what is valuable in certain ways, according to certain mindsets, often that are subconscious, often that are infected with ideas of misogyny and race. And if we fool ourselves that these ideas aren't inside us because of the societies we grew up in, then I think we're engaging in an act of damaging delusion. We've normalized this, and so any idea, any concept that says we need to engage in an act of self-analysis and question not just what we value, but why we value it and why we dismiss other things, that's really difficult, and it's really challenging. But I think, like a lot of things in 2020, this is actually a generational thing. I think what we're witnessing in almost all of these critical, movements for change is a generational shift. I was given a preview of Barack Obama's new biography, and he makes exactly that case, that this is the issues that we're battling about, the change of self-analysis, the new vision of ourselves we're trying to get in the mirror. It seems to me that the millennial generation get this automatically. They see these issues. They don't need to unlearn. They just see it automatically. I think it's a much easier position to be in.
Mm-hmm. I think, yeah. I mean, everything you're saying, I feel like I want to go in 10 different directions with all of it. I am going to turn to audience questions, but I'm going to ask you one last question before I do that, which is on the topic of our festival theme, which, as you know, is new worlds. And to your point about the younger generation, one of the questions that we've been asking our festival participants that I'd love to hear your thoughts on is just what kind of new world would you like to see, or what kind of new world do you want your children to inherit?
I think it's an amazing time to ask this question, because there was a part of me when the news of the vaccine was announced, worried that if we have this miraculous moment when science solves this crisis that has afflicted the world and killed hundreds of thousands of people, that we'll believe in our own delusion, we'll believe in our own magic even deeper. And it's not that I want this for a second to go on any longer. It's not that I want anyone else to get sick. It's almost as if I would prefer, this sounds ridiculous, I would have preferred us to have sorted this out with track and trace and on the ground community interventions, just like Ebola was defeated in Africa, because it's this narrative that we have the genius, that we have the spark of genius within us, and we can solve our problems and we can command nature. I think that's what's got us here. I think that's a really, really dangerous 18th and 19th century Enlightenment idea, which builds on biblical ideas of dominion. I'd like us to see this moment as a warning of our incredible fragility, both ecological, both epidemiological, and I fear we won't. I fear this shock has not rewired us in the way that it should have done. And again, it's very difficult. I'm not asking for a bigger shock. This is enough. I get it. It's been horrible. But I'm frightened that the way we were feeling in April and May about we need to reimagine the world, we've kind of lost that a bit. And that really frightens me. So I'd like a new world. I'd like us to think about the things we were willing to give up if we got our lives back in April and May, the big visions we had for reimagining the world and changing our lifestyles and listening to birdsong and all of that amazing stuff that happened in lockdown. I'd like us to be, for those people, for those ideas to live on beyond getting the jab in our arms and thinking we can go back to normal.
Yeah. We do have a great tendency to revert to the mean as humans, though, don't we? I mean, we will, if we can, we will snap right back. It's so interesting. We're such an adaptable species, and yet our adaptation is so much about trying to keep the status quo. And that's what we adapt to do, is to try to keep things the way they are. So there's such an interesting tension there. There are lots of great questions coming in, unsurprisingly. So I'm going to try to combine some of them in places to try to cover some ground. So there have been a couple of questions about different issues of accessibility that we mentioned but haven't actually discussed in any detail. So one question about to what degree do you think class is the real barrier in the UK? And I should say almost all of these questions are prefaced with people saying that they're great long-time admirers. So I'm not going to say that with every question. Let's just assume it, but it is being said regularly. But to what degree do you think class is the real barrier to true diversity? But there's also a question pointing out that it is disability. Sorry, I saw it and then it's gone away. It's Disability History Month this month. And a question about why there aren't more conversations about disability history. So I wonder if we can put those together in terms of this broader issue about real inclusivity and not just having a couple of hot points.
On the disability issue first, I mean, what there really should be is television programming and radio programming and more publishing on disability. And you know, I've tried to sell programs about the history of disability, which is absolutely fascinating. And one of the most interesting prisms to understand that our attitudes are not that old and not that deep. Some things are ancient, but that these what we think of as the ideas that have always been with us are actually quite novel. I think it's an incredibly important area of debate, and I don't see cultural products being produced about disability. I see lots of work on representation, but I don't see much cultural produce about disability. On the issue of class, I'm really wary about believing in a dichotomy between race and class. Now, obviously, they can be separated, but they're being separated very intentionally and very deliberately, again, to create electoral coalitions. This construct of the white working class has been a device of stripping Black people, who in Britain are more likely to be financially working class by those metrics than any other group in the UK. It's about creating these electoral coalitions where Black people are seen as urban and as metropolitan, and all of these other pejoratives, and working classness is seen as a white identity. So I'm very nervous about how this is being weaponized as a form of division, both in America and in the United Kingdom. It was very clear the way Trump spoke when he talked about the vote rigging, and he chose Detroit. Sorry, I should say the alleged nonsensical, baseless vote rigging. We know why he chose Detroit. It's 80% Black. This idea that unless that white families in the Midwest are real, the people, and the Black people from facing identical economic challenges somehow have no class identity, makes me very nervous of acknowledging these divisions, even though they are distinct issues.
Yeah, well, I'm afraid it being me now, I can't move off this topic without also mentioning the other big issue of inclusivity from my point of view, which is the role of gender and patriarchy in these conversations. And there's actually there's a point I make in relation to Trump, and then there's a question in that I'll connect it to. So the point in relation to Trump is that, as you know, Trump made gains among African-American men, actually, in this latest election, but it was African-American women who put the Democrats over the line, who carried it for Joe Biden in South Carolina, and as you say, in Detroit and in Philly, and in all of the cities that the Democrats took, it was African-American women who got the vote out and got the Democrats in. So I'm wondering about the role of patriarchy in all of this. And I want to connect it to a question that came in about, you will have seen this today, I'm sure, the new statue to honor Mary Wollstonecraft, which by Maggie Hamling, which was unveiled and has become quite controversial quite quickly. So I'm going to read, I think the question frames it really well and says, Hamling claims the figure represents every woman in the eyes of the artist is young, of European appearance, with a perfect figure. How does this statue enhance the reputation of a renowned philosopher and advocate for universal women's rights? And how do you think it will be viewed in the future? And so I wonder if we can just kind of connect those two issues and reflect a little bit about the role of patriarchy in all of this as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting that it's white. I mean, 70% of white men, so 50% of white men think Trump's okay. And that's, you know, I'm flying to America in a couple of days' time. I mean, that's the reality. Half of white American men, not Trump the candidate, but Trump having seen 4 years of him, think this is okay. And there's clearly something about that performative masculinity and Trump that attracts not just depressingly white men, but also black men. The fact that there is a difference and a widening difference between voting patterns among African Americans based on gender, I think I hope it says something specific about the appeal of Trump. And I hope it's not a bifurcation of the African American community, because in some ways, I guess we need to also not exaggerate it, because if you, in the last election, if only black people had been allowed to vote, and I have to say, because the Daily Mail exists, I'm not saying only black people should be allowed to vote, but if they had, then it would have been 50 states would have gone Democrat. So there is a difference there, and I think it's worrying, and I think we need more understanding of it. But I don't think it's as great as, it's depressing, but it's not as statistically significant as it might be. I'd seen the statue, I hadn't seen the controversy. I'm not a fan of statues in general, and I think statues are, a lot of people argue that what we need to do is we need to look at the memorial landscape, and we need to adjust it to represent people who have been excluded. I think we need to actually ask whether statues work for who we are. I know they mean a lot to a lot of people, and I know there's a legitimate argument that we should repopulate the memorial landscape with statues to people who've been neglected. But I think they're deeply problematic in all sorts of ways. They're also very often really terrible art. Figurative statues is a kind of, to me, it kind of belongs to the ancients. They were great at it. We've never really improved on what they did. Have we produced a statue better than Renaissance statuary? Really? Have we advanced the art form? I think to me it's a dead art form, and I would love to see artistic interventions about the work of artists that took a non-figurative form. I mean, the example I always use is, I'm from the Northeast, and the Angel of the North is about 2 miles from where I grew up. Now, if that had been a statue of a great industrialist like Ravensworth or Armstrong, the people who had built the Northeast, it would be a big statue of a Victorian bloke who did terrible things and had some horrible views, undoubtedly, with mutton chops and baggy clothes. And it would be boring. It would just be so nondescript. But instead, it's a representation not of a person, but of an industrial moment, the spirit of that part of the world. And it is one of the most loved works of art that I know. It's been the relationship between people of Newcastle and Gateshead to that statue has been compared to how Parisians feel about the Eiffel Tower. And I think that worked because it wasn't figurative. So I would love to see the work of artists brought to life in our public spaces in very creative interventions by artists. And I think that would be such an exciting brief, rather than let's have a figurative depiction of whoever it is. I hope that's not dodging the issue. Some of the problems of these debates about statues is I don't think statues are the right thing for us anymore. I mean, there's a statue outside the BBC of Orwell, and I love Orwell. Orwell means a lot to me, and I just feel nothing about that statue. But if an artist had been said, you know, this is where he started writing about 1984, and he was looking out that window towards Senate House, and that was his image of the Ministry of Truth, find an artistic intervention in this beautiful space about that, I think that could have been something really exciting. But Orwell, who was a kind of gangly guy who smoked too much and had a weird, everyone who met him said he had a very weird gait. His ideas are so much more interesting than his physicality.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point, because you come at it from the point of view of art, but then we can also just, you know, ask whether statues are good history. They're mute, right?
Yeah.
I mean, for me, I like my history to have more information.
Yeah. Well, they're exactly the opposite of history. I mean, history is mobile and fluid and plastic, and statues are literally set in stone.
Literally ossified, exactly. Yeah. And as you're saying, history needs to be rewritten, because that's what it is. It's a living form. We have a question coming in from the audience that is very dear to our heart at the festival. So I'm really glad it's come in, which is about, we've been talking mostly from the point of view of people working in history and in the humanities, and thinking about the role of the work that we do with these larger issues. But there is, of course, a very important question there, and we've touched on it, but it's worth bringing out more, I think, about the voices from outside the academy who have so much expertise and knowledge to bring to us, as it were, I don't want to think in terms of us and them, but to bring to the conversation. And so the question is, and this is what the festival really tries to do, which is to use the university as a liaison to try to create connections with different communities, and to get conversations that are really happening. Clearly, we need to do more. But do you think that universities are heading in the right direction? Do you have ideas about how we can figure out ways to break down those hierarchies of expert and general public, and start to really recognize how much shared knowledge and wisdom there is collectively?
I think the problem, the stage before that is inclusion. And universities don't look like their communities. Universities, in terms of class, in terms of race, they don't represent the cities that they're in. And that inclusivity should not be a problem. There should be no them and us, because that problem needs to be solved. And the rigidity that I see within funding bodies, and also within universities, about who has proven themselves worthy of a place to study or a place to do postgraduate work. I think that's an enormous problem. I think the lack of context in understanding people's journeys, the lack of willingness to be flexible, the lack of the possibility of being flexible because of these I think inflexible and intractable rules. I think that's an enormous problem. I keep hearing horror stories of people who have overcome incredible obstacles to have achieved degrees of academic success, and none of their context being taken into account in decisions about places and funding. If we're serious about this, if we're serious about the problem of our universities not reflecting our cities, then we need to understand that our criteria for entry and our criteria for funding are based on value judgments that have not been questioned. And the lack of context, I think, is enormously problematic. I mean, there's a very simple kind of personal context with myself. Is I'm dyslexic. I went to a very bad school. I failed my GCSEs, so I haven't got GCSE maths, which means I can't teach history in a British school. Now that's because we have a rigid system, a rigid criteria that doesn't take into effect that the council estate that I came from, the school that I went to, and that nothing about the trajectory of the 3 decades since that I failed that exam is taken into account. We have similar failings to accept trajectory and context in multiple places, multiple blockages within the system. We talk about pipeline failures. I don't think we're serious yet. I don't think university administrators, I don't think the funding bodies are serious.
I feel like there are probably some schools around the country that would hire you despite your lack of qualifications, David. But I don't want to make any promises.
To be fair, I can't do maths, and it's not that the wasn't an accident.
You might be
it wasn't
employable.
I deserve to fail. I still can't.
Now, look, I'm getting messages that unfortunately it's time for us to start wrapping up. But I am going to sneak in one last question, if we can do just a kind of like one example answer, because I think it's a great question. And somebody else who liked your phrase about soft play history and making history so safe and easy. And the question is, can you name a public history project or initiative that is not soft play history that you think people should know more about? I know it's slightly out of left field.
Well, I mean, I think it's the one that's been so controversial. It's the work that's been done at the University of Leicester and elsewhere about with the National Trust, about where the money came to build those houses. 93 of the properties the trust looks after have connections to slavery, to the East India Company, and to empire. And the fact that the government saber rattles about the National Trust for doing its job, understanding the history, understanding the trajectory that built those buildings, I think shows how deep a problem we have in valuing scholarship, in valuing the humanities, in valuing knowledge. Then that's an incredibly important project. To bring Orwell briefly again, Orwell said Britain is like a country. Britain is like a country that's like a rich family sitting around the table with no one wanting to discuss where the money came from. And when we literally find where the money came from for those exact houses where rich families lived, it literally, the government threatens the very valued public institution that undertakes that valuable work. That's not a healthy place for a country to be.
That's very well said. And honestly, I could keep talking about all of this with you all night, but unfortunately, that is all the time that we have. So I need to thank you very much, David, for that. I hugely enjoyed that, and I'm sure that everybody else did as well. A couple of reminders before we say goodnight. Just remind everybody, as you heard at the beginning, the Being Human Festival will run across the UK and online from the 12th to the 22nd of November. We do have a few socially distanced and live events, so please do look out for those. They have, of course, been designed in safe ways and are following local guidelines, so do look out. We do have some spots available, although many events have booked up, and you can find these on our festival website. We have two more in conversation events like this. I will be talking with the great Bonnie Greer, also OBE and also a festival patron, on Thursday the 12th, and we will be talking about the election. She and I are both from Chicago, and we are going to have our similar but different Chicago perspectives to bear on the election. And then Monday the 16th, I'll be in conversation with the writer Kit DeWall about books, whether judging books by their covers and how we value literature. So that would be on the more literary side of things. So that's just to let people know that those are happening. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us. I wish I could ask everyone to burst into applause to join me in thanking David for such a wonderful conversation and for giving so generously of your time and your thinking, but I'm sure everybody is applauding you in their homes, and I will applaud you now. Thank you very much, and thank you all for joining us. Have a wonderful evening. Good night.